Right, well, it's not spiders, is it? This is pseudoscorpions. So something different. And I'm also a beekeeper, amongst many other things. So controlling certain pests was an interest that I picked up because we have a particular pest in Britain, as you'll find out. And pseudoscorpions were considered that they might be possible to be used. Right, for those who aren't only into spiders, pseudoscorpions are tiny little things, as you probably realise, although there are some quite big ones. I've got a large one from Pakistan that needs identifying. A friend of mine gave it to me years ago, and it's absolutely enormous. But generally they're pretty small, and they live in soil and litter in the usual places. And some also live in nests. Mammals, you've got a lovely big one on the continent called Lassia churnes. It never quite made it across the channel when the channel flooded, so we don't get it in here. But if anyone pokes around moles' nests, bedding, you might come across it. There's a possibility. It's a great big one. It's very dark, handsome beast. Birds' nest, ants' nest, and bees, which is what we're coming on to in a moment. So there's quite a few in the world, and there's 29 odd species in Britain. Now, bees have all sorts of things that live in their nests or colonies. And you've got ants, as you can see, there's quite a few species there. You've got pseudoscorpions and termites and all sorts of strange things. Now, throughout the world, there are 8 species of different honeybee, and those are listed there. And the only 2 that concern us really are Apis cerana, the eastern honeybee, and Mellifera, the western honeybee. And of course, the western honeybee is the one that everyone uses. Most people use rather to get honey. You can get honey from cerana, but that's a Southeast Asian job, so we won't consider that. But the western honeybee has been spread all over the world by humans. They've taken them into all sorts of places with varying success, but generally speaking, they're pretty good creatures for getting honey. They have a number of species living with them of pseudoscorpions, and in Britain, Chelipha cancroides, which is not very commonly found, very rarely found. That can be found on the continent. You get it as well, but they tend to occur in low numbers, very low numbers. You also have Ellingsineus species, which are the ones that have been studied to see whether they can actually assist beekeepers, as we shall see in a moment. These feed on all sorts of rubbish in beehives, and I don't know if we've got any beekeepers here, but one of the jobs you sometimes have in the spring is to clean your beehive floors, if you haven't got a special floor on, to get rid of some pests, where all sorts of debris accumulates. The bees are always chomping away at the combs and cleaning up and dropping debris, and you've got bits of beeswax. Some dead bees, although bees are pretty hygienic, they usually toss out anything that's bad because they don't want any pests developing. And in amongst that debris live other arthropods. You've got mites, beetles, and moths and their larvae munching away on these lovely bits and pieces that the bees have dropped. It's a nice place to live. Consequently, you have a little habitat, a little community of different sorts of creatures, and it will include their predators. And pseudoscorpions, as earlier mentioned, the Chelipha, for example, will live inside the beehive happily munching on various things. Now, unfortunately, there's a particular mite that has been introduced into Britain called Varroa destructor. All these, sorry, I'll skip back. This pest came in from abroad. Now, we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. Obviously, a honeybee colony is a wonderful place to live. They strictly control their environment. They keep the humidity level. On hot days, you'll see bees all outside the hive because it's too hot inside. Bees at the entrance buzzing their wings to circulate the air and flush out the hot air. And in the winter, they cluster together if it's very cold, and they generate heat, so they can maintain a stable temperature of the colony between 33 and 36 degrees C. In the winter, of course, it won't be the whole colony, the whole hive that's at that temperature. It will be what is called the bees all clumped together into a cluster, what's called a cluster. And that cluster will maintain that temperature. And any bees that get chilly on the outside move inside, a bit like penguins in the Arctic. So they got very strict thermoregulation, and they got very careful humidity regulation as well. If it's very hot weather, they'll bring in liquid water and distribute it throughout the hive, and their fanning activity, their bee-driven excuse me, air conditioning will circulate the air so that it keeps it at a steady range of between 50 and 60%. If it's too damp, things will go moldy and you get all sorts of problems. But of course, bees are very clever. They've got other things that they can use to control mold and some of the other pests. Anyway, those conditions is a nice ideal place for pests and diseases. Now, there are several major pests of bees. In the past, there was one called the brawler, the bee louse, and this lives specifically with Apis mellifera, and it's very, very rarely found, as we shall, well, as you can see, because we use treatments to kill other pests inside the hive, which has also exterminated the bee fly, unfortunately. So we've driven it almost to extinction in Britain. There are also arachnid pests, and notable amongst these are the tracheal mite, which, as its name implies, lives in the trachea of the bee, where it feeds, and it can cause a lot of problems if the population builds up too much and clogs up their trachea. Obviously the bees suffer and eventually die. So this is not an uncommon pest. It's normally at a level where the bees can tolerate it, but it can, if the bees are stressed through various processes, if they get a bit upset about the weather, some pesticide use, or an annoying beekeeper keeping opening the hives or whatever, maybe not that, but anyway, they are a severe pest of the bees, and they can cause a big problem. However, there's an even worse mite which has only recently come to this country, and it's called Varroa destructor. It used to be they used to think it was one called Varroa jacobsoni, but it isn't that species. It's the destructor species. There's 4 species of this genus, which are found in Southeast Asia, and largely on the bee Apis cerana, but it was transferred to the honeybees in the 1960s. Typical human interference. Here we go, messing things up again. We introduced cane toads to control one thing in Australia and ended up with another mess. They were, we like to move bee colonies around everywhere because it's a good way of getting extra honey, and we do migratory beekeeping and take colonies into other places where they don't normally live. And what you're going to get eventually is a transfer of diseases, and in this case a mite, this nasty Varroa mite, which is now threatening apiculture throughout the world. It originally evolved on Apis cerana, and Apis cerana has tolerated it. It was a good parasite host relationship. It could clean them up and remove them and keep the population to below an economic threshold. Whereas with when it got onto Apis mellifera had no idea what it got on it, and As a result, it can overtake a colony very quickly. As a beekeeper, you are meant to check your Varroa levels, and if the level goes above 1,000, an estimate of 1,000 counts in a colony, then you have to do major treatments. So these mites will grow very quickly, the populations will rise very fast, and can cause a terrific lot of problems. It feeds on the hemolymph, but more importantly, well, that will stress the bee. The presence of the mites actually stresses the bees, which really reduces their efficiency of their immune system. But the Varroa also carry lots of viruses. So if you've got a suppressed immune system because you're stressed, then you've got a nasty creature going around sticking its proboscis in you, sucking you, and introducing lots of viruses. It's not going to do you a lot of good. And as a result, colonies can collapse. Now, how do these pests get around? Well, they use a process which I'm sure you're familiar with, but anyway, called forasy. Beehives are just like dung heaps and compost heaps and rotten wood. They're temporary habitats. So if you're a flying insect, no problem. You can be a beetle who wants to live in a nice bit of rotten wood, or you can be a fly living in a dung heap. You can just get there quickly. But things like mites and pseudoscorpions, it's a bit of a long walk to find your nearest compost heap or bee's nest or whatever. So they have a relationship with the organisms they live with, and they get there through a process of hitchhiking called forasy. It's a very interesting process. I won't go into that now, I haven't got time, but it involves them getting into a cataleptic state once they're attached. And Varroa mites use forasy to get around, but so do the pseudoscorpions that live within beehives. And one species which has been extensively studied is Alencinius indicus in India, and their populations inside beehives can be quite high. The actual pest, Varroa, is now virtually everywhere. This yellow one down here, I'll just have a drink. Is probably completely present now. That it is spreading very rapidly, usually through people moving bees, and it's only recently, last year, it entered Australia. So, well, they say 22, it's probably 22, 23, it entered Australia. So it's having a great impact on honeybee populations, and the production of all the wax and propolis and honey that you get is under threat because it's making it harder to keep bees. Pseudoscorpions obviously prey on lots of things in the beehive, and they will also eat Varroa. So people in India and in South Africa thought, wow, great, we've got these Alencinius living in our hives. Would they be any use for actually controlling Varroa? And lots of work was done having a look at it. It is like the honeybees, it's very restricted in what it likes. It is completely dependent upon honeybees. It has exactly the same requirements of nice hot conditions, relatively high humidity, and being in the dark. They're also phoretic, as I've said, so they can move between colonies by hitchhiking on the bees when they swarm. Alencinius indicus is naturally on Sirana nests and preys on those two species, and they appear to have minimal infestation because they evolved with it, as I've mentioned earlier, whereas the other species, of honeybee mellifera didn't. In Africa, you've got Sculpturatus and fulleri, which also eat varroa. But are these going to be any use? Now, it's a bit of a problem because we know very little what goes on inside beehives, what other species live there and how they live there, and what sort of food chain you have. Other things may also eat the varroa mites. But unfortunately, we need to be able to kill the mites very quickly. And although varroa may be a control, the processes we use at the moment are chemical. They use fluvalinate impregnated strips of plastic, which are toxic to the varroa mites and don't affect the bees. But there are problems with using chemicals because you can potentially get build-up of chemicals in the wax, and you've got to do it at special times so you don't get it in the honey. You're not allowed to use chemical treatments, when you're collecting honey, when the supers are on and the bees are storing it for your benefit. Honey occasionally gets tested for the presence of anything. Other chemicals are oxalic acid and formic acid, which can be applied either by injecting small quantities in solution in syrup between the frames in the middle of winter when they're less active, and it kills any residual mites. The bees will tolerate this. Or you can use vaporized oxalic acid, which you mustn't breathe in, it's not very good for you, and you puff that in. I'm not too keen on that particular method. There are physical ways of doing it as well, involving getting the colony and shaking all the bees and leaving as many mites behind as you can. So you effectively put the bees on new frames and set them up in a nice clean hive, but the population can soon build up again. You can try doing other things as well. And most modern beehives now have what is called a varroa floor, which is either a mesh or a series of strips of metal with narrow gaps, which are too small for the bees to get through, but the mites will drop through, so they fall off onto the ground. And a more advanced thing, and a lot of work's going into this now, is to actually find bees that will groom themselves, like the Apis cerana bees, which will actually remove their mites from both the comb and the individuals and help to keep the population down, because they evolved with it, so they've adapted this technique. But there are signs that there are varieties of honeybee that are learning, it's not quite the right word, but have developed this ability to some degree. And if you can breed a strain, obviously, to do that, that's a good idea. Now, the biological control, the use for them use for pseudoscorpions to control them, which, as I say, quite a bit of work was done on it, but it's not that easy, unfortunately, because it's probably impossible to rear sufficient numbers of them. Populations will build up. You can get quite high populations of pseudoscorpions within the colony, but the general management processes of looking after bees will tend to naturally reduce the number of predators as well as the number of pests when you're doing it. And actually getting enough to introduce into a hive. You can't just breed pseudoscorpions very easily. I have bred them, and it's a very slow process, and the ones I was using were relatively easy to do, but trying to do it with a species which is very specific, has a specific niche requirement, such as a beehive, would be very difficult indeed. So, although a lot of work's gone into trying to find out ways of protecting bees naturally, or as natural as possible, through biological control, it looks as if this, in fact, is a dead end for this particular thing.